It all began on a Monday that was way too bright and cheerful for the kind of chaos that was about to descend on my otherwise peaceful farm, because there I was, standing next to my "No trespassing, sheriff lives here, trespassers will be ticketed" sign, sipping coffee like a normal law-abiding landowner when Karen, the human embodiment of a cease and desist letter, decided that my farm was the perfect place to practice her parallel parking skills, completely oblivious to the fact that she had no legal claim, moral claim, or even basic common sense to be anywhere near my property. She drove her oversized, glittering white SUV through my gate like it was the red carpet at some Hollywood event she imagined herself hosting, rolled down the window, and with the confidence of someone who thought HOA bylaws were suggestions written in invisible ink, she announced, "I'm just parking for a second," as if mere seconds could magically grant her rights over my land, which, by the way, I had meticulously inherited, protected, and occasionally mowed in the shape of a smiley face for passing drones to admire. And naturally, I said, in a tone somewhere between a tired parent and a man who had seen too many reality TV HOA horror stories, "No, Karen, you are not parking here, and the cow pen is off limits too, because the cows have feelings and, frankly, a better sense of personal space than most HOA presidents I've met." But she ignored me with the kind of arrogance only someone who binge watches property reality shows can cultivate, parked halfway on my prized pumpkin patch, and strutted toward me as though my warning signs were merely decorations rather than legally enforceable statements, at which point I tried reasoning, calmly explaining the virtues of trespass laws, personal boundaries, and most importantly, that her heels could puncture the pumpkins, but she cut me off mid-sentence with a glare so intense it could curdle fresh cream, and before I could even think to reach for my sheriff's badge in my back pocket, which, spoiler alert, no one knew I had, she slapped me, a swift, cartoonishly loud slap that echoed across the pasture, startling the chickens into forming an improvised conga line, and I will admit, for a millisecond, I considered calling in a group of highly trained squirrels to chase her SUV off the property just to maintain farm decorum, but then the adrenaline kicked in, my sheriff instincts kicked in, and I calmly yet dramatically removed my sunglasses, pulled my badge from my pocket, and said, in a voice meant to convey both authority and disbelief that a human could be this ridiculous, "Karen, I am the sheriff," which caused her eyes to widen like a cartoon character realizing the vending machine just ate her last quarter, and in true Karen fashion, she responded not with apologies, not with reason, but with a shrill, indignant, "What?" that could have shattered glass if we weren't on a reinforced farmhouse porch, and then the argument escalated into a full-blown spectacle that involved her accusing me of being mean, unreasonable, and possibly abusive to pumpkins, me pointing out the legal precedent for my right to enforce trespass laws on my own land, the cows forming an accidental barrier because apparently they preferred me over Karen, and her SUV slowly rolling backward as if it were contemplating its life choices, all while I narrated the entire scene internally with dramatic flair for when I inevitably shared this story at the sheriff's office later, adding embellishments like, "Her perfume smelled like defeat," and "The wind carried justice," because when you're facing a Karen, theatricality is both a weapon and a shield. And naturally, she refused to leave voluntarily, so I had to gently but firmly walk her to the edge of the property, pointing out where my farm ended, where the HOA's imaginary jurisdiction began, and where her sense of entitlement clearly got lost somewhere in the mailbox, at which point she tried one last desperate tactic, which involved pretending to faint dramatically onto the gravel like she was starring in a low-budget soap opera, forcing me to step back, dodge the falling body, and simultaneously resist the urge to photograph the moment for posterity, because honestly, social media needed to see that Karen had finally met her match in a sheriff who also happened to own a pumpkin patch, and after 5 excruciatingly long minutes, a minor dust cloud, 1 chicken conga line, and the very real threat of a lawsuit if she touched my pumpkins again, she finally staggered off, muttering about suing the sheriff, which I found ironic because, unbeknownst to her, anyone daring to challenge me legally would be met with a precise combination of small-town justice, farm dogs trained in intimidation, and my uncanny ability to recite the local code by heart while juggling a clipboard and a bucket of feed, and as I watched her glittery SUV disappear down the dirt road, I couldn't help but laugh, not because the situation was funny, which it absolutely was, but because, deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a battle that would involve HOA letters, minor civil disturbances, pumpkin sabotage, and possibly a few strategically placed cow pies, and so I returned to my porch, polished my badge for dramatic effect, fed the chickens for moral support, and made a mental note to add handling Karen to my resume, because if there's one thing I learned in law enforcement, it's that some people think rules are suggestions, property lines are optional, and sheriff badges are decorative, and in the next few weeks, Karen's attempts to assert dominion over my farm would escalate in ways both hilarious and absurd, involving HOA meetings where she brought PowerPoint presentations that no one requested, neighborhood watch complaints filed against an imaginary Mina sheriff, and a covert operation to place reserved parking for HOA elite-only signs in my pasture, which, spoiler alert, I removed with flair while wearing cowboy boots and a grin that screamed, "Nice try, Karen, but you're about to meet the full extent of farm law enforcement." And just when I thought I could return to a calm life of feeding animals and enforcing minor ordinances like a responsible adult, I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding I remove all "No Karen Zone" signage because apparently targeting one person is discriminatory, and I laughed out loud, loud enough for the cows to moo in solidarity, realizing that this was not just about pumpkins, property, or personal space, but about teaching Karen, and anyone who thought they could stroll onto my farm like it was a shopping mall, that the sheriff doesn't just enforce laws. He enforces sanity, decorum, and the unspoken rule that anyone who slaps a sheriff on their own property is about to become a very bad anecdote for the local newspaper. And as the sun set over the rolling hills, casting a golden glow on my humble yet fortified farm, I could feel the tension, the drama, and the humor building like storm clouds on the horizon, ready to burst into a full-blown HOA versus sheriff showdown that would involve legal letters, chicken surveillance, pumpkin booby traps, and Karen, inevitably, making yet another spectacularly bad decision. The morning after Karen's spectacular slap-and-flee performance, I awoke to the soothing sounds of my farm, the cows lowing like gossiping neighbors, the chickens clucking in what I could only assume was code for "prepare for drama," and the faint, unmistakable crunch of gravel under tires, which immediately set my sheriff senses tingling, because I knew before opening my eyes that Karen had returned, and sure enough, there she was, peeking over the hill in her glittery white SUV like a raccoon, trying to judge the neighborhood from a borrowed crown, and I swear the audacity was breathtaking. She had brought reinforcements in the form of her HOA buddies, all dressed in khaki shorts and pastel polos, armed with clipboards, measuring tapes, and the kind of smug expressions that scream, "I will lecture you about imaginary rules until you cry." And I had to resist the urge to greet them with a red carpet and champagne because the only reception they were getting on my farm involved legal authority, practical jokes, and possibly a strategically placed scarecrow in a sheriff uniform, which, incidentally, I had been perfecting since the first slap incident as both a deterrent and a source of ironic amusement. And as they slowly drove up my driveway, Karen waving like a pageant queen who misunderstood the concept of consent, I stepped outside in my denim overalls, badge gleaming, cowboy hat at a rakish angle, and a grin that could be interpreted as both friendly and legally threatening, and I said loudly enough for the chickens and cows to hear, "Morning, Karen. Brought friends to help you understand trespassing laws?" Which earned me a collective gasp from her entourage, and the way she opened her mouth to reply, I swear, I saw the tiny gears of entitlement grinding in her brain, followed by the realization that no, she could not, in fact, lecture the sheriff about parking rights, property lines, or pumpkin etiquette. And that's when the games began because Karen, never one to accept defeat gracefully, had apparently spent the night devising a foolproof plan to reclaim my farm, which in her mind involved planting tiny flags labeled HOA property in my pasture, attempting to take measurements of my crops with a level and a protractor as if she were building a bridge, and most egregiously, trying to convince her friends to take selfies with the pumpkins, presumably as evidence that they were appropriating HOA space, which I found both offensive and hilarious because if the pumpkins could talk they would have asked for royalties. And as I watched this spectacle unfold, I knew that subtlety was no longer an option, so I activated my well-honed sheriff dramatic tactics, which involved a series of escalating responses. First, the official glare, the kind that had been known to stop neighborhood squirrels mid-flight. Then, the authoritative stomp, which in my experience could intimidate even the most stubborn farm dogs. And finally, the tactical reveal of my farm's defense perimeter, which included a combination of strategically placed hay bales, a couple of extremely territorial geese, and a sign reading, "Violators will be fed to the geese," metaphorically. Or not. Which Karen ignored entirely because nothing says, "I am in denial of authority," like a grown adult waving measuring tape at you while standing next to a hostile goose, and at this point, one of her HOA minions, a man with the unfortunate nickname Clipboard Carl, tried to negotiate, using phrases like community standards, visual appeal, and shared spaces, which in sheriff speak, translates roughly to, "I have no legal standing but I brought friends anyway," so I responded. With a combination of patient calm and theatrical flair, "Gentlemen, this is my land. You may attempt to measure it, photograph it, or argue about it all day, but until the paperwork says otherwise, these pumpkins, these chickens, and this gravel driveway answer to me, which caused Carl to drop his clipboard, clutch his chest, and mumble something about mental health leave. And while all this was happening, Karen attempted a sneakier maneuver. She tried to park her SUV behind a haystack, presumably hoping for the element of surprise, which was bold until the geese discovered her car, honking like they were auditioning for a horror soundtrack, flapping with enough fury to create a minor windstorm, and forcing Karen to abandon her vehicle in what can only be described as a dramatic retreat worthy of a low-budget action movie, complete with her heels stuck in the mud and her scarf flying like a wounded flag. And at that precise moment, I decided it was time to escalate further. So I retrieved my secret weapon, the pumpkin catapult of justice, a contraption I had built for exactly this scenario, designed to launch rogue pumpkins at trespassers with maximum comedic effect and minimal property damage. And as I positioned the first pumpkin, I couldn't help but narrate the scene internally with the kind of flair normally reserved for epic medieval battles, imagining subtitles appearing on the screen. Sheriff versus Karen, the battle for pasture domination. While Karen and her entourage scrambled, trying to avoid being accidentally splattered by produce, which, in addition to teaching them humility, also reminded them that farm law enforcement could be both effective and highly entertaining, and of course they retaliated in kind, though their weapons were mostly verbal. Loud declarations about HOA rights, the phrase, "this is harassment," repeated ad nauseum, and a futile attempt to call the county line for backup, which, spoiler alert, went nowhere because the only emergency they had was realizing they were trapped in a pasture with a sheriff, angry geese, and a pumpkin arsenal. And so the standoff continued for hours, involving Karen tripping over her own feet while trying to take notes, her friends accidentally falling into a mud puddle while measuring imaginary property lines, me calmly sipping coffee while dodging the occasional flying pumpkin, and the cows providing occasional commentary in the form of well-timed moos that seemed to cheer me on. And by mid-afternoon, I had begun introducing additional elements to the spectacle. Strategically placed sprinklers to make the ground slippery for the invaders, a few fake, "beware of sheriff" signs, and a drone shaped like a hawk that I flew overhead to add intimidation factor, all while narrating dramatically for posterity, because if there's one thing I've learned about Karens and HOA mobs, it's that humor, drama, and carefully deployed farm ingenuity go further than anger or yelling. And as the sun began to dip, casting an orange glow over the pumpkin-splattered battlefield, I finally cornered Karen near the edge of the property, pointing out that she could either leave peacefully, learn a valuable life lesson, or risk becoming the next viral video featuring a grown adult chased by geese and pummeled by pumpkins. And she, in her infinite stubbornness, tried one last bluff, waving her arms and shouting about legal rights and suing the sheriff for emotional distress. At which point I removed my sunglasses, tapped my badge for emphasis, and delivered the line that would echo in local legend: "Karen, this is your last warning. Step off my property or the geese get creative," which of course, made her finally retreat, dragging her soggy scarf behind her like a trailing defeat, leaving her HOA minions to stumble after her, muttering about community engagement and the absurdity of rural law enforcement, while I watched triumphantly, silently congratulating the chickens for their unwavering support, and knowing full well that tomorrow would bring another round of insanity, probably involving a drone invasion, more signage, and perhaps a small parade of farm animals in formation, because Karen, bless her, was nothing if not persistent, and persistence, when combined with ignorance, makes for endless entertainment when you're the sheriff of a pumpkin patch. And as I sipped the last of my coffee watching the sun set on the victorious pasture, I mentally prepared for the next day, knowing Karen would return with new schemes, new energy, and probably a new type of glitter, and that I, armed with farm ingenuity, legal authority, and a ridiculous sense of humor, would be ready to face her, geese, pumpkins, and all. By the third morning of Karen's relentless crusade against my farm, it was clear that subtlety, diplomacy, and even the occasional well-placed pumpkin warning were no longer going to suffice, because she had clearly spent the night crafting a new strategy that involved spy-level sneaking, stealthy SUV maneuvers, and the dramatic use of a pair of binoculars that, frankly, had no right being that expensive on a HOA budget. And I spotted her at dawn, crouched behind the oak tree at the edge of my property, peeking through the lenses like she was auditioning for a low-budget espionage film, while her glittery SUV was hidden behind a suspiciously large pile of hay bales, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be the kind of hay bales that smell faintly of desperation and entitlement. And as I watched, the chickens, ever alert, began forming a defensive perimeter, clucking like tiny alarm sirens, while the cows, unimpressed but curious, stared her down like they were trying to communicate, "We have seen your kind before, Karen, and we do not approve." And it was at that precise moment that I realized subtlety was dead, so I retreated to my barn, donned my full sheriff outfit, badge gleaming, boots polished, and hat tilted at just the right angle to convey both authority and impending hilarity, because if you're going to handle Karen at espionage level, you need dramatic flair and the occasional absurd theatricality, and armed with my trusty bucket of feed, a few strategically placed pumpkins and a walkie-talkie that I planned to use for dramatic monologues, I set out to intercept her, and what followed was nothing short of cinematic, because she had apparently recruited reinforcements from the HOA who were dressed in camouflage shorts, pastel shirts, and sunglasses that screamed, "We are here to measure your property and maybe your soul," and they tiptoed across my pasture with clipboards in hand, only to immediately disturb a nest of extremely territorial geese, who erupted into a flapping, honking frenzy, chasing them like feathery SWAT team members trained to defend the law and the sacred pumpkin territory. And as Karen tried to organize her troops, she tripped over a strategically placed hose that I had left the night before, sending her sprawling dramatically onto the grass in a perfect imitation of a soap opera faint, while I, standing atop a hay bale for maximum sheriff effect, delivered a booming, "Karen, your espionage ends here," which caused her binoculars to fly through the air, narrowly missing a pumpkin, and at that moment, I knew it was time to deploy my ultimate countermeasure, the farmyard force field, which was essentially a combination of sprinklers, strategically placed scarecrows, and the occasional well-aimed pumpkin catapult, designed not to harm, but to create maximum confusion and hilarity, and as the geese charged, the sprinklers went off, and the pumpkins flew in gentle arcs. Karen and her entourage stumbled in every direction, slipping in the mud, ducking from harmless projectiles and simultaneously trying to salvage what little dignity remained, which I will admit, was almost impossible, because dignity tends to evaporate when faced with flying vegetables and geese honking in unison like an alarm choir, and as they scrambled, I began narrating the scene internally with the kind of dramatic flair reserved for epic battles, imagining slow-motion sequences of Karen flailing HOA minions diving into mud puddles and geese swooping in like winged generals, while I, calm and collected, stepped over a mud puddle with the precision of a trained lawman, and at one point, Karen attempted a desperate negotiation tactic, waving her arms and shouting, "We demand a meeting. This is harassment. You can't." And then she slipped on the wet grass, landed in a mud puddle, and I swear even the chickens paused their clucking to admire the comedic timing, and that was when I realized that Karen had truly underestimated the combination of farm ingenuity, sheriff authority, and dramatic flair, because while she was busy flailing and mud splattering, I calmly, yet theatrically, corralled her SUV with a rope, gently guiding it off my property, and at the same time, issued a stern but humorous warning about trespassing, espionage, and future pumpkin-related consequences, which she, soaked and humbled, attempted to argue against while balancing on one muddy boot, resulting in a spectacle that I was certain would be recounted in local HOA horror stories for decades to come. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the victorious pasture, I deployed the finishing move, a perfectly timed pumpkin catapult that gently launched a pumpkin directly in front of Karen, forcing her to step back in shock, trip over her own shoelaces, and finally, retreat with the sort of defeated wail that sounded like a mix between a banshee and someone realizing their favorite reality show had been cancelled mid-season, and her HOA minions, seeing their fearless leader vanquished by a sheriff, farm animals, and carefully engineered pumpkins, quickly followed, muttering about property rights, community standards, and maybe next time they'd read the local code before attempting a covert invasion, and I, triumphant, stood atop the hay bale, surveyed the battlefield of mud, flying pumpkins, and flustered HOA operatives, and let out a dramatic, victorious laugh that echoed across the pasture, because at that moment, I realized that while Karen might return, she would never again underestimate the combination of law enforcement, farm ingenuity, and absurdly comedic justice, and the geese, sensing victory, strutted with regal flair, the chickens clucked in celebratory chorus, and the cows, ever dignified, gave me a slow nod of approval, all of which confirmed that the sheriff, the farm, and the pumpkins had won at least for now, and as I sipped my now lukewarm coffee, watching Karen disappear in the distance with her shiny SUV and bedraggled entourage, I knew the story was far from over, but the lesson had been delivered in unmistakable style. Never, ever underestimate a sheriff with a farm, a sense of humor, and a very specific set of skills involving pumpkins, geese, mud puddles, and the ability to turn even the most absurd trespassing attempt into a cinematic masterpiece of justice. and as the wind rustled through the cornfields and the sun painted the sky with the golden hue of triumph, I prepared for the inevitable next encounter, confident that with each slap, slip and pumpkin launch, Karen was learning that in this little corner of the world, I didn't just enforce laws. I created them, narrated them, and occasionally turned them into slapstick comedy, which, as every sheriff knows, is the ultimate weapon against entitled HOA invaders. And so, with chickens perched strategically for observation, cows grazing with dignified approval, and geese ready for deployment, I leaned back, admired my farm, polished my badge one last time for effect, and whispered to myself, "Bring it on, Karen. I'm ready for Act 4. The day Karen decided to escalate from passive-aggressive trespassing and clumsy espionage to full-blown HOA coup attempt dawned with a suspiciously loud drone buzzing over my farmhouse, which immediately triggered my internal alarm system, part sheriff instinct, part caffeine-fueled paranoia, because I had learned, after 3 consecutive days of absurdity, that Karen did not do subtle, she did spectacle, and sure enough, peering through the barn window, I saw her SUV parked strategically on the hill. A squadron of HOA minions armed with clipboards, measuring tapes, and what appeared to be a small flag labeled HOA Sovereign Zone marching toward the property line, and I knew at that moment that diplomacy was dead, decorum was irrelevant, and the farm animals were about to star in a slapstick saga of epic proportions. So I grabbed my sheriff hat, my badge, my trusty bucket of feed, and a megaphone I had salvaged from the county fair, because if Karen was going to attempt a coup, I was going to narrate it like a professional sports commentator while simultaneously defending my pumpkins, cows, and very fragile sense of dignity, and the ensuing spectacle was nothing short of legendary because Karen, in her infinite delusion, had apparently read a 2-page HOA pamphlet about community takeover strategies, and decided that marching in synchronized steps, shouting slogans like, "Property for all," and "We want parking rights," while flapping clipboards like swords would somehow intimidate the sheriff of a pumpkin patch, which, in my opinion, was a tactical miscalculation of monumental proportions, and I responded with a combination of tactical brilliance and comedic genius, deploying my previously honed arsenal, strategically placed sprinklers that turned the ground into a mud pit, geese who had been secretly trained to execute aerial honking strikes, chickens performing defensive perimeter dances that could only be described as poultry martial arts, and of course my patented pumpkin catapult, which I loaded with a combination of small, medium and outrageously oversized gourds designed to create maximum chaos while minimizing actual injury, and as Karen and her squad stormed the property line, screaming about HOA authority and community standards, I unleashed the first salvo of pumpkins, which, combined with the sudden eruption of geese from behind hay bales, sent her minions scattering, slipping in mud puddles, screaming for mercy and wildly swinging clipboards to defend themselves against airborne vegetables, while Karen herself, glittery scarf drenched in mud, attempted to salvage the coup by climbing atop her SUV, declaring in a voice that could shatter glass, "This is tyranny. You can't do this. We demand justice," which of course, was immediately countered by a well-timed pumpkin bouncing off the hood of her car, ricocheting in slow motion like a Hollywood stunt sequence, while I, atop a strategically placed hay bale, narrated the entire incident over my megaphone with dramatic flair, declaring, "Ladies and gentlemen, behold the downfall of Karen. Witness her hubris meet its match in law, poultry, and winter squash," and at that exact moment, a particularly brave goose executed a surprise swoop maneuver, honking with the ferocity of 1,000 sirens, sending Karen tumbling off the SUV in a spectacular mud dive, which prompted her minions to abandon the coup entirely, slipping and sliding like an uncoordinated ice skating troupe as I advanced through the pasture with measured steps, badge gleaming, cowboy boots squelching in the mud, and a grin that said both, "I am in charge," and "This is going in the county newsletter," and of course as the chaos unfolded I introduced additional strategic elements for maximum comedic effect. A hay bale rolling obstacle course, buckets of feed acting as minor trip hazards, and strategically placed "Beware of Sheriff" signs featuring my stern but hilarious mug, all of which caused Karen and her HOA forces to flail, stumble, and eventually retreat, slipping past the chickens performing synchronized clucks of approval, while the cows provided moral support in the form of approving nods and occasional low, supportive moos, and after what could only be described as a cinematic half-hour of mud, feathers, flying pumpkins and shouted HOA slogans, Karen finally, utterly and completely surrendered, waving her arms in defeat while muttering about suing the sheriff, demanding community meetings, and "This is harassment," in a tone that suggested she might actually believe the geese were legally entitled to vote, and as she slunk down the driveway dragging her soggy scarf behind her, I rounded up the last of her minions with gentle encouragement, a few strategically lobbed pumpkins, and the occasional honk from the geese that seemed to say, "You have learned humility, now leave." And once the property was secure, I returned to the porch, mud-splattered but triumphant, surveying the battlefield of flattened grass, displaced pumpkins, drenched HOA minions, and a few chickens who looked like tiny heroes, and I couldn't help but laugh, because the absurdity of the situation, the dramatic flair, and the undeniable justice of the farm, administered by a sheriff who could handle both property law and slapstick, was too perfect. And as I sipped a victorious coffee, polished my badge for effect, and waved to my cows who grazed like stately citizens acknowledging their rightful law enforcement, I knew that Karen had learned an important lesson about boundaries, authority, and the inherent danger of underestimating a sheriff with a farm, a sense of humor, and the ability to orchestrate complex poultry assisted justice. And though I suspected she might return with yet another ridiculous plan involving drones, glitter, or possibly a marching band claiming HOA supremacy, I felt prepared, confident, and ridiculously entertained, because on this farm justice wasn't just enforced, it was performed with flair, comedy, and an army of farm animals who understood exactly how to deal with entitled neighbors. And as the sun set, casting long dramatic shadows over the victorious pasture, I leaned back, tipped my hat to the geese, admired the heroic chickens, and whispered to myself, "Bring it on, Karen, next time I'll be ready with marshmallow catapults," fully aware that the saga would continue, but certain that no matter what ridiculous plan she devised, the sheriff, the pumpkins, the geese, and the dramatic authority of farm law would always emerge victorious, leaving Karen drenched, humbled, and endlessly entertaining for anyone lucky enough to witness the legend of the HOA showdown of the century. And as the final golden rays glinted off my badge, I knew beyond all doubt that my farm had not only survived Karen's onslaught but had become a fortress of hilarity, law, and absurdly theatrical justice. And the chickens clucked in harmony, the cows nodded solemnly, the geese strutted in victory, and somewhere in the distance, Karen plotted her next move, blissfully unaware that she had just starred in a dramatic, hilarious, and utterly humiliating defeat that would be recounted. 4 years as the day a farm, a sheriff, and a very specific set of skills turned HOA chaos into pure comedic legend. Just when I thought the dust, mud, and flying pumpkins had settled, and the geese had returned to their dignified patrols along the pasture, I noticed a suspicious shimmer on the horizon. Karen, of course, had not given up. She had retreated, yes, but only to plan what could only be described as the HOA's most elaborate, desperate, and entirely ridiculous comeback in history. And that morning, I awoke to find little flags planted all along the driveway, each one proclaiming HOA surveillance zone, in glittery letters that practically screamed, "We are back and we are shiny." And while my first instinct was to stomp, shout, and summon the geese for immediate aerial retaliation, I realized the true brilliance of Karen's strategy. She had escalated to psychological warfare, and if I wanted to maintain peace on my farm, and avoid a lawsuit for excessive pumpkin deployment, I had to play along while secretly preparing the most elaborate countermeasures imaginable. So I spent the next several hours designing a multi-tiered defense system that involved strategically placed sprinklers rigged with color dye, a pumpkin catapult arsenal graded by size and velocity, and the chickens, who had apparently signed an unspoken alliance with me, trained to perform distraction maneuvers in case of a sneak attack. And as the sun climbed high in the sky, I saw Karen approach again, this time in full tactical HOA regalia, carrying a clipboard, a tape measure, and what I could only assume was a homemade property rights enforcement wand that looked suspiciously like a pool noodle decorated with glitter and tape. And she marched up my driveway like a general leading troops into a battle they had already lost, muttering about community engagement and coordinated legal strategies, while I, in full sheriff regalia, emerged from the barn like some rural superhero, badge gleaming, boots squelching in mud from the previous day's conflicts, and a grin that suggested both amusement and impending justice. And immediately the standoff began. Karen attempted to assert HOA dominance by measuring imaginary lines in my pasture, waving the glittery pool noodle and declaring, "I am within my legal rights," to which I responded with the full force of my dramatic authority, announcing over my megaphone, "Karen, I am the sheriff, this is my farm, and those pumpkins are witnesses to your impending humiliation." And the geese, sensing the tension, honked in perfect synchronized alarm, while the chickens scattered in strategic formations that could have been mistaken for a miniature military parade. And as the glittered pool noodle came dangerously close to touching a pumpkin, I unleashed a carefully calculated salvo, launching medium-sized pumpkins in arcs that were mathematically designed to spook rather than injure, causing Karen to flail, stumble, and land dramatically in a puddle of mud with the kind of sound effect that only nature and determination could provide. And, as she attempted to regain composure, her clipboard slipped from her hands, landing perfectly atop the hood of her SUV and sticking there thanks to the combination of mud and glitter glue, which prompted her HOA allies to gasp, fumble, and trip over themselves while trying to retrieve it, and I, watching from a distance with a cup of now lukewarm coffee, realized that the situation had escalated to full-blown theatrical chaos, a level of absurdity that could only be described as both epic and hilarious. And as the hours passed, Karen attempted multiple maneuvers, sneaking behind hay bales, signaling her minions with hand gestures resembling semaphore, attempting to bribe my farm dogs with what looked like gourmet dog treats, and even sending a carrier pigeon wearing a tiny HOA hat with a note demanding I cease and desist immediately, which, naturally, the dogs intercepted with dramatic flair, resulting in a brief mud and feathers skirmish that left everyone except the sheriff completely exhausted and humiliated. And by mid-afternoon I decided it was time to escalate further, because if Karen wanted a full-scale confrontation I was prepared to deliver, so I activated the Rainbow Defense System, a combination of color dye sprinklers, strategically placed mirrors to reflect sunlight into her eyes, and my chickens performing synchronized flapping maneuvers to create the illusion of an incoming tornado of poultry, all while narrating over my megaphone, "Behold the might of farm justice. Witness the fury of pumpkins, geese, and my impeccable sense of humor." And it worked spectacularly because Karen, attempting to retain dignity while slipping in dye-splattered mud, finally yelled, "This is harassment. I demand legal action." And in response, I calmly produced my sheriff's badge, my clipboard of local ordinances, and a photo album titled, "Karen Attempts on My Farm," a documentary, which included detailed accounts of mud puddle slips, pumpkin ricochets, goose charges, and chicken formations. And as she gasped, horrified at the photographic evidence, I explained in my calmest sheriff tone, "Karen, these are the consequences of trespassing, escalating espionage, and underestimating a farm's legal authority." While the geese flapped in what could only be interpreted as approval, the chickens performed an elaborate victory jig, and the cows, ever dignified, gave a slow, solemn nod, because on this farm animals understood justice in ways that HOA members never could. And after what felt like an eternity of dramatic standoff, Karen finally, utterly and completely retreated, dragging her glittery scarf, soggy pool noodle, and crushed ego down the driveway, muttering something about, "Next time we'll bring lawyers," which I quietly doubted because lawyers tend to flee from chickens performing military maneuvers and pumpkins launched with deadly precision. And as I surveyed the battlefield of colorful mud, scattered pumpkins, defeated HOA minions, and triumphant animals, I realized that this epic saga had not only preserved my farm, my sanity, and my pumpkins, but had also provided endless material for dramatic storytelling, comedic narration, and the kind of legendary tales that would be told at local fairs for years to come. And so I returned to my porch, polished my badge for effect, sipped what was now cold coffee, and reflected on the absurdity and glory of my victory, knowing full well that Karen would return inevitably because she never gives up, but also knowing that the combination of sheriff authority, farm ingenuity, absurd humor, and animal-assisted tactical defense would always be ready to greet her. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the victorious, pumpkin-littered pasture, I couldn't help but whisper to myself, "Bring it on, Karen. Next time I'll add glitter bombs to the arsenal," fully confident that no matter what new HOA scheme she devised, the sheriff, the farm, the pumpkins, the geese, and the heroic chickens would be prepared, vigilant, and dramatically hilarious. And somewhere in the distance, Karen plotted her next move, blissfully unaware that she had already become the star of a story so ridiculous, dramatic, and funny that it would be remembered forever as the day a farm, a sheriff, and a very specific set of skills turned HOA chaos into legendary laugh-out-loud justice.